Philemon 15 through 19 says, "For perhaps there was for this reason separated from you for a while, that you would have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother, and especially to me, but much more to you, both in flesh and in the Lord. If then you regard me as a partner, accept him as you would me. But if he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge that to my account. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will repay it, not to mention that you owe me even your own self as well." Well, if you're joining us in reading through this 60-day reading plan, today's reading is Philemon, and I encourage you to read that passage. Now, it is much easier to see God's working in our lives by looking back rather than evaluating it in the present. God has a way of working things in a way that we cannot understand while we're living through it, but it becomes crystal clear at some point down the road. I have an interesting story to tell you. Perhaps you've heard it before. It concerns my chaplain in the Army. In 1977, I was planning on leaving the Army and going to college and seminary and then returning to the Army as a chaplain. Well, Chaplain Clark, who had been my discipler and mentor for the previous 3 years, began to have problems in his left eye. And he ended up being diagnosed as having a very rare cancer in that eye. Now, I watched how he handled it. Now, I had known that his mother had died of cancer and that this diagnosis probably affected him, thinking that possibly it was his time to be taken home. Well, the doctors at Walter Reed removed his eye and in the process captured all of the cancer. And while he lost his left eye, he was ultimately restored to active duty. Only 2,000 people a year in the United States are diagnosed as having that particular cancer. So why did I watch him go through that? What was the purpose to me being there at that time? Well, fast forward to 2015. I was diagnosed as having that exact same cancer in my right eye, but I knew exactly what to do. I knew exactly how to handle it. It was in God's timing, God's purpose that those things occurred. Onesimus had been a slave and he'd run away from Philemon. Through circumstances which we really don't know, he and Paul crossed paths and became a believer as he served Paul. Paul also recognized that he, Onesimus, had the responsibility, and it was to return to Philemon. But this is where the story gets very interesting. Paul tells Philemon to charge anything that Onesimus owed him to Paul. This is a picture of exactly what Christ has done for us. I don't know why God allowed my chaplain and myself to have the exact same cancer, but I know that he will use that fact to his glory. Onesimus was a runaway slave, and yet in that act he found Christ, and 2,000 years later, we can use that story in our own lives to glorify God. So why does God allow things to happen? He allows them so he might be glorified. What are we to do when things happen to us? We're to glorify God through our lives so that he might be glorified.